Please save me from him.
The marriage between Victoria and Robert Hammond had been a mistake from the beginning, though Victoria was only beginning to understand the full extent of that mistake in the spring of 1890. Robert was a wealthy man, handsome in a way that made women's hearts flutter at first glance, and utterly devoid of conscience beneath his charming exterior. He was also increasingly abusive, not in ways that left visible bruises, but in ways that were equally devastating. Cutting remarks about Victoria's appearance, deliberate humiliation in public, control over her finances and her movements, and a temper that erupted over minor infractions. Victoria's younger sister, Elizabeth, had come to stay with them for the winter, fleeing a difficult situation in her previous employment as a governess. Elizabeth was gentle-natured, beautiful in a quieter way than Victoria, and completely unaware of the danger she was walking into. It started with looks. Robert's gaze lingering on Elizabeth longer than necessary. Small comment about how lovely Elizabeth looked in particular colors. An unnecessary hand on her shoulder, lingering just long enough to be uncomfortable. Victoria saw it all and felt a sick dread building in her chest. "Don't be alone with him," Victoria whispered to Elizabeth one afternoon, pulling her sister into a quiet corner of the house. "Promise me you won't be alone with him." Elizabeth, confused by the intensity of her sister's warning, promised without fully understanding why such a promise was necessary. But Robert was growing bolder. He began manufacturing situations where he could encounter Elizabeth alone. He would appear in the hallway when she was leaving her room. He would find reasons to come into the kitchen when the servants were away. He would corner her in the library, speaking in low tones about how he'd always wondered what it would be like to know her better, to understand her, to have her understand him in ways Victoria never could. "You're more like me than she is," he told Elizabeth one afternoon, his voice slick with false intimacy. "She's cold, unfeeling, but you have warmth. You have passion. You understand the world in a way she never could." Elizabeth, frightened and unsure how to respond to these advances without causing scandal or hurting her sister, became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped coming to meals. She took walks alone, desperate to get away from the house and Robert's predatory attention. And Victoria, watching her sister's distress, felt rage building inside her, rage directed at a husband who seemed to view his wife and her sister as interchangeable commodities to be used as he desired. The confrontation came on a cold evening in March. Robert, emboldened by alcohol and his conviction that Elizabeth would eventually succumb to his advances, made a more direct move. He entered Elizabeth's room after she had retired for the evening, intent on forcing the issue. Elizabeth's scream brought Victoria running, and what she witnessed, Robert attempting to restrain Elizabeth as she fought him off, sent something primal inside Victoria into overdrive. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and struck Robert across the head with all the force she could muster. Robert collapsed, blood pouring from a wound on his temple. For a moment, Victoria thought she might have killed him. Part of her didn't care. Robert recovered consciousness within minutes, his rage at being attacked by his wife combining with his humiliation at being stopped before he could assault Elizabeth. He was furious, vengeful, and dangerous in a way he had never been before. "You've made a grave mistake," he told Victoria, his voice cold and controlled despite the blood dripping down his face. "Both of you have made grave mistakes, and you're going to regret every moment of defying me." What followed was a nightmare of escalating cruelty. Robert confined Victoria to the house, claiming she had attempted to murder him and that she was mentally unstable. He began spreading rumors through Denver society that his wife was mad, violent, and dangerous. He locked Elizabeth in her room, claiming she needed to be protected from her sister's instability. He cut off Victoria's access to money, her friends, and any way to contact the outside world. He was, methodically and deliberately, constructing a prison from which neither sister could escape. It was during this dark time that a young cowboy named Daniel Mercer arrived at the Hammond estate. Daniel was a skilled horseman who had been hired to work with the Hammond horses, and he had no idea that he was walking into a situation of domestic horror. What Daniel witnessed in the first week of employment alarmed him deeply. Victoria moved through the house like a ghost, barely speaking, her eyes haunted. Elizabeth was never seen, though occasionally Daniel would hear sounds of distress coming from the upper floors. And Robert moved through it all with a proprietary satisfaction, speaking to Daniel about the burden of managing women, about how they required firm hands and stricter discipline. Women are naturally inclined toward hysteria and disobedience, Robert told Daniel one afternoon, as if sharing a piece of wisdom. You have to show them who hold the power. Otherwise, they become impossible to manage. Daniel, who had been raised by a strong-willed mother and had deep respect for women's autonomy, felt contempt for Robert Hammond rising in his chest. He began asking subtle questions of the household staff. How long had Mrs. Hammond seemed this withdrawn? Had anyone seen Miss Elizabeth recently? What was the nature of Mr. Hammond's business that required such isolation from society? The picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Victoria had become a prisoner. Elizabeth was being held captive. And Robert Hammond was a man who had become intoxicated with power and was using it to destroy two women who had dared to resist him. Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He began leaving the barn door unlocked at night. He began leaving a horse saddled and ready near the back of the property. He began leaving supplies, water, bread, money, in a hidden location. And one night, he left a note in a place where he knew Elizabeth would find it during her brief moments of supervised freedom. The note was simple. If you want to escape, everything you need is waiting. Trust me, I won't let him hurt you again. It took Elizabeth 3 nights to gather the courage, but on the 4th night, she made her move. She crept down the stairs, found the supplies Daniel had left, and moved toward the back of the house where Victoria was being kept. "We have to go," Elizabeth whispered, shaking her sister awake. "There's a man, a cowboy. He's helping us escape." Victoria, who had been on the verge of complete breakdown, felt a spark of hope ignite. Together, the sisters made their way to the barn, where Daniel was waiting with 2 saddle horses and a clear plan. "I have a friend who owns a ranch about 50 miles north," Daniel told them. "He'll shelter you there. I'll tell Hammond that you escaped while I was working in the south pasture. By the time he realizes what's happened, you'll be far enough away that he won't be able to find you." "He'll come after us," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "He'll hunt us down. He can't allow us to leave. It would damage his reputation." "Then we'll make sure he's too occupied to hunt," Daniel replied. "Once you're safe, I'm going to the authorities with everything I know about what he's done. The injuries he's inflicted, the confinement, the attempted assault. By the time they're finished with him, he won't have the freedom or the resources to pursue you." The escape was successful. The sisters made it to Daniel's friend's ranch, a sprawling operation managed by a kind man named Michael Sutton, who asked no questions and simply offered them sanctuary. And true to his word, Daniel went to the authorities and presented evidence of Robert Hammond's crimes. Robert was arrested, tried, and convicted of assault, false imprisonment, and attempted rape. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence that sent shockwaves through Denver society, as it exposed the dark reality of what happened behind closed doors in respectable homes. But the story didn't end with Robert's imprisonment. In the weeks following their escape, as Victoria and Elizabeth began to heal from the trauma they had endured, Daniel visited them regularly at the ranch. He brought them books. He helped them understand that what had happened was not their fault. He treated them with a respect and gentleness that slowly rebuilt their faith in human kindness. Victoria recovered first. She began to understand that she was strong, that she had survived, and that survival was itself a victory. She began to help Elizabeth through her own healing process, both sisters finding strength in their shared experience and their shared survival. Elizabeth, meanwhile, found herself developing feelings for the man who had risked his position and his safety to help them escape. Daniel had not rescued them out of romantic interest. He had rescued them out of principle. But as Elizabeth healed and began to see the world through eyes no longer clouded by fear, she recognized something remarkable about him. One evening, as Daniel was preparing to leave the ranch after checking on the horses, Elizabeth asked him to stay and talk. "Why did you help us?" she asked. "You barely knew us. You risked your job, your reputation, everything. Why?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Because what he was doing was wrong," he said finally. "And because I grew up watching my mother work herself to exhaustion, watching my father treat her with contempt, watching her accept it because she believed that was simply what marriage was. I swore that when I was grown, I would never stand by and watch another woman be treated that way. And when I saw what was happening to you and your sister, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I had to act. And now, Elizabeth asked softly, "What do you want now?" Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and Elizabeth saw something shift in his expression. "I want to know if you're healing. I want to know if you're beginning to understand that what happened doesn't define you. And I want to know, when you're ready, if you might consider building a different kind of life. Not one defined by fear or control, but one defined by choice, by partnership, by genuine love." He paused, and Elizabeth saw vulnerability in his weathered face. "I'm not offering rescue," he continued. "You've already rescued yourselves. I'm offering partnership, equality, a life where your voice matters and your choices are honored. If you ever want that, I'm here." Elizabeth said yes, not immediately, but after months of healing, after conversations that built genuine connection, after trust was slowly and carefully reconstructed. When she finally said yes, it was not because she was grateful or indebted, but because she had come to love the man who had seen her in her darkest moment and had chosen to act with integrity and courage. Victoria, watching her sister find happiness with Daniel, began to rebuild her own life. She became an advocate for women trapped in abusive marriages, using her story to demonstrate that escape was possible, that help existed, and that society's judgment of women who left their husbands was less important than their survival. She eventually married Michael Sutton, the kind man who had offered them sanctuary, and together they built a ranch that became a haven for other women fleeing domestic violence. And Daniel, who had risked everything to help two women he barely knew, became known throughout the territory as a man of principle, someone who would stand up against injustice even when it was costly, even when it was dangerous, even when it would have been easier to look away. Years later, when people asked Elizabeth about the moment Daniel handed her the note offering escape, she would speak of the profound realization that there were people in the world willing to risk themselves for strangers. That goodness existed alongside cruelty. That sometimes, when you were trapped in darkness, a single person's integrity could be the light that showed you the way out. "He didn't rescue me," Elizabeth would say. "He gave me the tools to rescue myself. And then when I was ready, he loved me. That's the real redemption. Not being saved, but being given the choice and support to save yourself, and then being loved for the strong woman that survival makes you become."